Cleopatra did not die the moment Egypt fell. She lived through what came after. In August of 30 BC, Roman soldiers entered the royal palace in Alexandria. They did not come to execute her. They came to preserve her, not as a person, but as property. Doors were sealed, guards were stationed at every threshold, messengers were screened, objects were catalogued and removed. The war had ended. Her captivity was beginning. What happened in those final weeks was not a story of poison or serpents. It was a process, calculated, systematic, and designed to achieve something far more complete than death. This is what they actually did. When Octavian's forces entered Alexandria on August 1st, 30 BC, the city surrendered without siege. No walls were breached. No fires were set. The transition was administrative. Cleopatra remained inside her palace, but the palace was no longer hers. Roman soldiers arrived in formation. They did not storm the building. They occupied it. Entrances were reassigned. Interior routes were mapped. Certain rooms were sealed. Others were cleared. Guards were posted, not to protect her, but to monitor her. Ancient sources describe the placement of sentries at specific intervals. Plutarch records that soldiers were instructed to prevent any act of self-harm. Dio Cassius notes that food was inspected before delivery. Sharp objects were removed. Mirrors were taken. Cosmetics were searched. This was not detention. It was specimen management. Cleopatra was allowed to move within designated areas. She could speak to attendants, if those attendants were approved. She could send messages, if those messages were reviewed. She could request items, if those items were cleared. Every action required permission. Every permission was delayed. The palace still contained her belongings. Her furniture remained in place. Her clothes were accessible. But the structure itself had been recategorized. It was no longer a seat of power. It was a holding facility. Outside the palace, Alexandria continued functioning. Markets operated. Temples opened. Grain shipments were processed. Roman administrators began cataloguing tax records, mapping property boundaries, and interviewing officials. Inside, time stopped. Cleopatra was not executed, not tortured, not interrogated. She was maintained. Days passed without resolution. Cleopatra sent requests to meet with Octavian. Those requests were acknowledged, but not answered. Letters were delivered, but responses were delayed. Proposals were submitted, but decisions were postponed. Roman administration did not reject her outright. It processed her slowly. This delay was not accidental. Roman power operated through procedural control. Outcomes were determined not by refusal, but by the management of time. Every unanswered message reinforced a single reality. She could no longer initiate action. Her daily routine became structured by absence. Meals arrived, but at irregular intervals. Attendants were present, but rotated without pattern. Requests were logged, but fulfillment was suspended. The palace itself became a map of restriction. Certain corridors were accessible, others were closed. Some rooms remained furnished, others were emptied. The layout she had known for years was reorganized into zones of permission. This was not imprisonment in the traditional sense. It was spatial redefinition. Cleopatra had governed Egypt for 21 years. She had negotiated with Julius Caesar, commanded naval fleets, and managed an empire that stretched from Syria to Cyrenaica. She spoke 9 languages. She had overseen diplomatic summits, religious ceremonies, and military campaigns. None of that knowledge applied to her current situation. She could not negotiate with guards who were following orders. She could not command soldiers who were not under her authority. She could not leverage relationships that no longer existed. Every tool she had used to maintain power, persuasion, alliance, strategic delay, financial leverage, had been removed from the equation. What remained was her physical presence, and Rome had calculated the exact value of that presence. While Cleopatra remained under guard, Rome was already rewriting her identity. This process had begun years earlier. After the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Octavian's propaganda machine had systematically redefined Cleopatra in Roman consciousness. Official documents avoided her royal titles. Public speeches described her not as a monarch, but as a foreign influence. Coins stopped bearing her image. Written accounts emphasized seduction over statecraft. Her capture did not create this narrative, it finalized it. For Roman audiences, Cleopatra was no longer the pharaoh of Egypt, the descendant of Ptolemy, or the co-regent who had stabilized a fractured dynasty. She was an enemy of the state, documented, verified, and soon to be displayed. Roman law required physical evidence for a triumph. Victory was not declared, it was demonstrated. Enemies were presented in sequence. First their weapons, then their treasures, then their leaders. Cleopatra was being preserved for that sequence, but the process required more than her survival. It required her transformation from ruler to exhibit. This transformation happened through language. Roman officials stopped addressing her by title. Messages referred to her as the Egyptian or the woman. Diplomatic protocols that had once governed interactions with foreign monarchs were replaced with instructions for handling captives. Her authority was not stripped, it was reclassified. Inside the palace, this reclassification had physical consequences. Items associated with royal function were removed first, seals were confiscated, ceremonial objects were catalogued, official correspondence was collected, anything that indicated administrative power was separated from her quarters. What remained were personal effects, but even these were sorted. Jewelry was inventoried, cosmetics were examined, clothing was inspected. The distinction between personal property and state assets was being determined by Roman assessors. Cleopatra was present during this process. She could observe the categorization of her own belongings, but she could not contest it. On August 3rd, 30 BC, 2 days after the occupation began, Cleopatra was granted an audience with Octavian. This was not a negotiation, it was an inspection. The meeting took place inside her own palace, but the room had been cleared by Roman soldiers. Guards stood at every entrance. The furniture had been rearranged. The space she had controlled for 2 decades was now configured for Roman purposes. Octavian entered with scribes, not advisors, scribes. The meeting was being documented. Ancient sources provide fragments of what was discussed. Cleopatra reportedly attempted to justify her alliance with Mark Antony. She presented financial records. She offered access to royal treasuries. She proposed terms for her children's safety. Octavian listened. He did not refuse her requests. He did not accept them. He acknowledged them. Then he left. The meeting lasted less than an hour. No agreements were formalized. No promises were made. No timeline was established. But the meeting served a function. It confirmed that Cleopatra still believed negotiation was possible. And that belief was useful to Rome, because it meant she would continue behaving as though outcomes were still undecided. As long as she believed resolution was pending, she would remain compliant. She would not attempt escape. She would not organize resistance. She would wait, and waiting was exactly what Rome needed her to do, because every day she waited was another day Rome could prepare the triumph. After the meeting, Plutarch records that Cleopatra believed she had made progress. She thought Octavian had shown clemency. She interpreted his restraint as flexibility. But Octavian's restraint was not clemency. It was scheduling. He had already determined her fate. He simply had not disclosed the timeline. Cleopatra's position had never rested solely on her own authority. It rested on succession. Her eldest son, Caesarion, publicly acknowledged as the biological child of Julius Caesar, represented a problem Rome could not parade. His existence complicated Octavian's narrative. If Julius Caesar had a legitimate heir, Octavian's claim to Caesar's legacy became disputable. A living son with royal and Roman lineage created a potential rallying point for opposition. Caesarion was 17 years old in 30 BC. He was sent away from Alexandria before the city fell, evacuated south toward the Red Sea with instructions to reach India if necessary. But he was recalled. Sources conflict on whether he returned voluntarily or was intercepted. What is certain, he was executed shortly after. The method is not recorded in detail. The decision was. Octavian's advisor Arius is quoted by Plutarch. Too many Caesars is not good. Caesarion was removed from the equation. The other children were not. Cleopatra had 3 younger children with Mark Antony: Alexander Helios, age 10, Cleopatra Selene, age 10, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, age 6. They were taken into Roman custody, alive, not as prisoners in the traditional sense. They were reassigned. Roman practice did not automatically execute the children of defeated enemies. It absorbed them. They were transported to Rome, placed in households, and raised under Roman supervision. Cleopatra Selene would later be married to Juba II, the Roman-appointed king of Mauritania. She would govern as queen, mint coins with her image, and produce heirs who would integrate into Roman imperial lineage. But that future was not presented to Cleopatra as reassurance. It was presented as removal. Her children would survive, but not as Egyptians, not as Ptolemies, not as heirs to her dynasty. They would continue as Roman assets. For Cleopatra, this clarified the terms of her situation. Rome did not need to kill her children to neutralize them. It only needed to relocate them. And once they were relocated, her leverage disappeared. She could not negotiate for their safety. They were already secure. She could not bargain for their release. They were already being processed.